Well, I'm joined now by Jon Ryle, a former consultant to the United Nations on Sudan, who works for the Rift Valley Institute, an organisation that specialises in Eastern African affairs. Jon Ryle, how much of a breakthrough is this, or will it be, if the UN actually agree it tonight?
Well, I think it will show some concerted agreement among the Western powers to actually do something. Whether what it does is going to actually solve the problem of Darfur is another question. But it's a start, and I think they've got to see it through, and they've got to see it through with some force, which is particularly the provisions of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which allows the UN force to intervene to protect civilians without consultation with the government.
This is a hybrid force. It's part African Union, part UN, and the UN part is in itself mainly African. I mean, is this really going to be able to stand up to the banditry and thuggery that dominates Darfur?
No, I don't think you can solve that problem. I mean, part of the difficulty is that a UN force is primarily a peacekeeping force. There is no peace in Darfur. There isn't actually even a very active peace process, and that's why the peace process is actually more important. Now, there have been some steps in that direction. There's a meeting next week, I think, scheduled in Arusha in Tanzania. But the problem in Darfur is that, for once, the problems are not entirely the making of the government, because the rebel groups are so divided and split practically every week that it's actually quite difficult to get them to adopt even a unified position, let alone an actual unified movement.
But it sounds an absolute minefield to send anybody into. I mean, 26,000 may sound a rather large force, but Darfur is a huge area. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people adrift there.
Yes. And I think that actually if the people in the UN General Assembly talked to their own staff on the ground, they'd find, because I've just returned from Darfur, there's actually a great deal of concern about whether the hybrid force can actually achieve anything except the expenditure of huge amounts of money.
Well, that doesn't sound like much of a breakthrough then, does it?
You could say it's better than nothing.
I mean, Gordon Brown and Nicolas Sarkozy have engineered this together, and they managed to get Bush behind it. We don't really yet know even whether the Chinese will vote for it, but one presumes they're not going to veto it. It'll take a year to put together. How serious is the situation that you've just witnessed on the ground in Darfur? I mean, people talk about famine any minute.
Well, I think that the difficulty in Darfur is that people are always trying to settle the last phase of the war. And the fact is that Darfur has moved on. It's moved on from the genocidal attack that we saw 2 years ago, 1 year ago. And now, actually, a lot of the fighting in Darfur is between Arab groups, both of which have been supported by the government in the past. Everybody is fighting for territory, Lebensraum, political power. And that's an incredibly complicated situation. You're intervening in many decades of local conflict, which has become pathologically intensified by this huge inpouring of weapons. And so the UN has to have a very intricate kind of intelligence-gathering operation to understand how these local conflicts map onto the wider conflict.
Well, now, I've just heard, I mean, the Reuters are filing a more detailed account of the resolution, which has been watered down even since Gordon Brown's speech. Instead of an authority to seize weapons and take them, this force will only be allowed to monitor the movement of weapons and whether weapons are present. It's a fat lot of good, isn't it?
Well, again, it's better than nothing. I mean, it is good to be able to say unequivocally what is happening in Darfur, because that has been a problem as well, actually knowing what's happening. People say, it's big, it's the size of Spain, it's the size of Texas. More to the point, it doesn't have roads like Texas does. Although in a strange way it's connected because of modern satellite communications, so that rebels can talk to each other and talk to the world press. But actually, knowledge of what's happening on the ground, given that the government knows what's happening on the ground. And I think if the UN can build a kind of parallel intelligence gathering capacity, it will be on the way to developing the necessary supple and very long-term, complicated diplomatic initiatives to keep the peace process on track.
Jon Ryle, thank you very much indeed for coming in.